She stood outside that door, holding 3 years of her own silence in her hands. The financial reports, the ledgers, the letters she had written and signed and solved every single one while her husband stood inside that room, laughing with his friends. She heard his voice clearly through the wood. "Wait, I have a wife." The room erupted in laughter. Elizabeth did not move, did not breathe, did not let a single tear reach her face. She simply looked down at the papers in her hands and made a decision that would change everything. Subscribe now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The summer of 1818 came to Whitmore Hall the way it always did, loud, bright, and entirely unconcerned with the people living inside it. The hall had been built by Alexander Whitmore's grandfather, a man who believed that the size of a man's house was a direct measure of the size of his ambitions. 3 stories, 14 rooms, a formal dining room that seated 30, and a drawing room that had hosted every significant family in Virginia at least once. The grounds stretched out across 400 acres of tobacco land timber and river-fed pasture that had been in the Whitmore name for 60 years. It was by every measure that Richmond society used to measure such things a magnificent estate. And for the past 3 years, it had been running almost entirely on the quiet, relentless, unacknowledged work of one woman. Elizabeth Whitmore was 31 years old. She had brown eyes that missed very little, and hands that were never quite free of ink because she kept her own records in her own hand, and trusted no ledger that she had not personally reviewed. She had been married to Alexander Whitmore for 4 years, the first year a genuine attempt at partnership, the following 3. A gradual, quiet education in what it meant to be married to a man who was present in every room, except the ones that required his actual attention. Alexander was not cruel. That was the complicated part. A cruel man would have been easier to be angry at. Alexander was charming and handsome and genuinely well-liked by every person who encountered him at a dinner party or a hunt or a card table, which was, Elizabeth had come to understand, almost exclusively where he encountered people. He was the kind of man who made everyone in a room feel that they were the most interesting person he had ever met, which was an extraordinary gift, except that it required him to be in rooms constantly performing that gift, leaving everything else to the person he had married and subsequently forgotten to notice. She had noticed when it started. 3 years ago, shortly after their first wedding anniversary, when a crisis with the tobacco harvest had required someone to sit down with the estate's accounts and figure out what could be sold, what could be borrowed against, and what needed to be renegotiated with the merchants in Fredericksburg. Alexander had been invited to a fox hunt that week. He had gone. He had asked her with genuine and uncomplicated confidence to have a look at the numbers while he was gone. She had looked, and she had never stopped looking, because what she found in those accounts and in the correspondence that accompanied them, and in the contracts that had been signed without sufficient review, and in the arrangement that the estate's man of business, a Mr. Charles Henley, had been quietly constructing for his own benefit, over 18 months, required someone to pay attention, required someone to act, required someone who understood that the Whitmore name was sitting on a foundation that was cracking in places no one could see from the outside. Alexander had come home from the fox hunt 4 days later, well-rested and full of good stories, and asked her whether everything had been sorted. She had told him yes. She had not told him everything it had taken to sort it. She had not told him about the 3 nights she had spent awake with the ledgers, about the letter she had written to the bank in Richmond, carefully worded, precisely argued, that had bought them a renegotiated payment schedule on the estate's outstanding loan, about the quiet conversation she had initiated with their 2 largest tobacco buyers that had secured commitments for the following season before the market shifted. She had not told him because he had not asked, and she had kept not telling him season after season because the estate needed someone to manage it, and she was there, and she was capable, and she had convinced herself in the way that capable women have always had to convince themselves that this was simply what marriage required. That contribution did not need to be acknowledged to be valuable. That as long as the estate survived, and the name held, and the hall kept its lights burning, something meaningful was being built. She had been building it, alone, for 3 years, On the evening of July the 12th, 1818, Alexander held the largest gathering Whitmore Hall had hosted in 5 years. He had planned it with the enthusiasm he brought to everything social: the guest list, the menu, the seating arrangements, the entertainment. He had not asked Elizabeth about any of it, which was not unusual, and he had not included her name on the invitations in any formal capacity, which was also not unusual, and he had told her 3 days before the event that he expected it to be a wonderful evening, and he was sure she would see to anything that needed seeing to. She had. The food was arranged, the candles were placed, the linens were pressed, the staff was briefed and positioned. The wine was selected and decanted and set at the correct temperature, which Elizabeth had read about in a letter from a French correspondent of her father's, and had taken the trouble to implement because no one else in the house knew to. She had done all of this, and then she had gone to her study with the financial reports that had been waiting for 3 days, for a moment when she could sit with them without interruption, because there was something in the accounts that needed Alexander's attention. Something that could not wait much longer. She had been sitting with those reports for 40 minutes when she heard the laughter from the drawing room. Not the ordinary laughter of a party she was accustomed to that had learned to work through it the way you learn to work through rain. This was a specific burst of laughter, loud and sudden and carrying a particular quality that made her lift her head from the page. She heard Alexander's voice. She could not make out the words at first. She pushed back her chair. She walked to the study door and opened it and stepped into the hallway. The drawing room doors were ajar. The party was at its height. She could hear the voices of 30 people, the clink of glasses, the particular sound of wealthy people enjoying themselves with the comfortable confidence of people who expected to enjoy themselves. She heard Henry Caldwell's voice. "Alexander, you have everything a man could want." She heard Alexander laugh, the warm, easy laugh she had fallen in love with once. Almost everything. Almost. A third voice, she thought it was James Rawlings. What on earth could be missing? A pause. The kind of pause that a man made when he was about to say something he thought was amusing. "You know," Alexander said, and she could hear the grin in it. "I was trying to think of something witty just now, and I realized, wait." Another pause, theatrical, enjoying its own timing. "I have a wife." The room burst. Genuine laughter. 30 people, the best families in Richmond, finding it genuinely funny that the master of Whitmore Hall had momentarily, publicly, comedically forgotten that he was married. Elizabeth stood in the hallway. She did not move for a long time. She was holding the financial reports in both hands. The pages she had been working through before the laughter pulled her out of her chair. The pages that detailed in careful columns exactly what the Whitmore estate owed and to whom and by when, and the pages that also detailed in her own handwriting, in the margin notes she kept for her own reference, what she had done about each item one by one across 3 years. She stood there and listened to the laughter die down, and listened to the conversation move on, and listened to her husband's voice, easy and warm and present as he talked with his friends about the hunt next week, and the summer gathering at the Pendleton estate, and the new mare that Caldwell had bought, and everything that made up the texture of a life that was entirely untroubled by the details of its own survival. She looked down at the papers in her hands. Something happened in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger, and was instead something colder and more clarifying than either. She turned around. She walked back to the study. She set the financial reports on the desk. She sat down. She looked at her wedding ring, a simple gold band that Alexander's mother had pressed into his hand on the morning of their wedding, with the instruction that he take care of it, and take care of the woman who would wear it both in the same breath as if the ring and the woman were things of equal value. She did not take it off. She was not a woman who made dramatic gestures. She was a woman who made decisions. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her. She picked up her pen, and she began to write. Not a letter of farewell, not a declaration of hurt or anger or any of the feelings that were moving through her in ways she was not going to spend the evening entertaining. She wrote something more precise than any of those things. She wrote a list. At the top, in her careful, legible hand, she wrote the date. July 12th, 1818. And then she began to document everything, every action she had taken on behalf of the Whitmore estate in the past 3 years. Not in general terms, not managed the accounts or handled correspondence. Specifically, with dates with amounts with the names of the people she had negotiated with, and the terms she had secured, and the problems she had identified before they became catastrophes, and the catastrophes she had quietly resolved before anyone with Alexander's name had been required to know about them. She wrote for 2 hours, 31 separate entries. The renegotiated bank loan, March 1816, interest rate reduced by 1/8 payment timeline, extended 18 months, saving the estate approximately $400 in the first year alone. The tobacco buyer agreements, August 1816. 2 separate letters to Hargrove and Sons and Kellner Trading, securing forward commitments at favorable prices before the market shifted downward, resulting in the estate's best revenue season in 4 years. The timber contract, January 1817, identified and negotiated directly a new relationship that Alexander had known nothing about until the first payment arrived, and he had said pleasantly, "Oh, good thinking, whoever thought of that?" She had thought of it. She wrote it down. The discovery of Charles Henley's arrangement. This one she wrote carefully, fully, with every detail she had uncovered over the past 14 months. Charles Henley, who had been the estate's man of business for 8 years, who Alexander trusted completely, who Alexander had called the most reliable man I know at a dinner party. Not 3 months ago, Charles Henley had been skimming from the estate accounts for at least 2 years. Small amounts, irregular timing distributed across enough different line items that a person not looking carefully would never see the pattern. Elizabeth had been looking carefully. She had found it 9 months ago. She had spent 5 months building documentation so complete and so unambiguous that there was no possible innocent explanation. She had been deciding for the past 4 months how to present it to Alexander, how to explain what she had found without requiring him to understand simultaneously that it had been found because she had been doing a job he did not know she was doing. She wrote every detail into the list. She wrote the final line last. "Your estate survives because your wife remembered what you forgot." She folded the pages. She put them in an envelope. She sealed it. She set it on the corner of the desk where she knew, because she knew every routine of this household, including the ones Alexander never noticed, that the morning houseman would find it when he came to open the study at 7 o'clock. She addressed it in her own hand. For Alexander Whitmore, to be read in the morning. Then she stood. She straightened the papers on her desk. She capped the inkwell. She extinguished the lamp. She went to bed. She did not cry. She lay in the dark and listened to the party sounds floating up from below. The laughter, the music, the easy noise of people enjoying a life that was running smoothly, because someone they were not thinking about had made it run, and she breathed slowly and let herself feel the full weight of what the evening had given her. Not devastation, something clearer than that. She had been useful for 3 years and invisible for 3 years simultaneously, and she had told herself that was all right, that usefulness was its own kind of meaning, that the estate's survival was enough to justify the silence. It was not enough. She understood that now, with a certainty that was almost peaceful. She was not going to leave. Not tonight. Not without having said what needed to be said. But she was done. Done managing in silence. Done solving in secret. Done being the thing Alexander forgot he had, while the thing she was doing held everything together. Tomorrow he would read the list. And then she would see what he was made of. She closed her eyes. She slept. Alexander Whitmore woke at 7:30 the following morning with the mild, comfortable headache of a man who had enjoyed a very good party and expected his morning to follow its ordinary pattern. He came downstairs expecting coffee and the quiet of a morning house still settling after a late night. The houseman Robert was waiting at the bottom of the stairs with an expression that Alexander could not immediately read. "Good morning, sir," Robert said. "Morning, Robert. Coffee, please, and—" "There is a letter, sir." Robert held it out. "Mrs. Whitmore left instructions that it was to be given to you first thing." Alexander took the envelope. He looked at his name on the front in Elizabeth's handwriting. He turned it over. "Where is Mrs. Whitmore?" he said. "In the East Garden, sir. She said she would be available when you were ready to speak with her." Alexander carried the envelope to the study. He sat down at the desk that he used primarily to sign documents that had already been prepared by other hands. He opened the letter. He began to read. He read for a long time. He turned the first page, the second, the third. He read the entry about the bank loan and he read the date. March 1816, 2 months after he had come home from a weekend in Charlottesville and found the accounts sorted. And he remembered with a clarity that hit him somewhere he did not expect exactly what he had said. Everything sorted, and she had said yes, and he had said good and poured himself a bourbon and not asked a single other question. He read the tobacco buyer agreements. He read the timber contract. He read the entry that said, "Oh, good thinking." Whoever thought of that, she had written his own words back to him in quotation marks with the date, and something happened in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. Then he reached the section about Charles Henley. He read it once. He turned back to the beginning of it and read it again. Then he set the pages down on the desk. He sat for a long time without moving. Charles Henley, who had been managing this estate's business affairs since before Alexander had inherited them, who Alexander had trusted without question because his father had trusted him, and because trusting him meant not having to understand the details himself, who had been stealing from the Whitmore estate in careful distributed amounts for at least 2 years. And Elizabeth had found it 9 months ago, and she had spent the subsequent months building a case so thorough, so documented, so impossible to dispute, that it could be taken to any court in Virginia and it would hold. Alone. Without telling him. Because, and he understood this with a particular shame that was arriving in him slowly, like cold water rising, because she had not believed he was paying enough attention to receive the information. Because she had been managing everything in silence for so long that even a discovery of this magnitude had been folded into her private management, her private solving, her private record-keeping. She had been running his estate. All of it. The estate that bore his name and that he stood at the center of at parties and that his friends admired and that he had never, not once in 3 years, sat down with her to understand. He read the final line again. "Your estate survives because your wife remembered what you forgot." He put the letter down. He looked at the desk in front of him. At the surface, he had sat at hundreds of times to sign his name to things already completed and decided and managed. At the pen that sat in the holder that Elizabeth had replaced 3 weeks ago, because the old one was worn, he had not noticed, had simply found a working pen in its place and used it. He pressed both hands flat against the desk. He breathed. He thought about the drawing room last night, about the laughter, about his own voice, easy and performative, delivering a punchline about a wife he had forgotten. She had been standing in the hallway. He understood that now. The timing. The letter waiting to be written, the 2 hours it would have taken her to write it, she had been in the hallway. She had heard it. She had gone back to her study. She had written him 31 entries. She had gone to bed, and she had waited in the East Garden for him to be ready. He stood up. He picked up the letter. He walked out of the study, through the house, past the evidence of last night's party, still being cleared by the household staff, the glasses, the linens, the remnants of an evening he had managed to fill without her, and he went to find his wife. Elizabeth was sitting in the East Garden with a cup of tea that had gone cold and a book she had not been reading. She heard his footsteps on the path, and she did not look up. Immediately, she gave him the moment to arrive, which was the kind of small, considered courtesy she extended to everyone. Even now, even in this. He stopped in front of her. She looked up. His face was different than she had seen it in a long time. Not performing anything, not managing any impression. Something had been removed from it, some layer of ease that she had always understood without fully articulating it to herself, was a kind of armor. He was holding the letter in both hands. "Elizabeth," he said. "Alexander," she said. He opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. He was searching for something she could see at the right place to begin. "Charles Henley," he said finally. Yes, she said. You have documentation. Complete, she said. Every transaction, every date, every amount cross-referenced with 3 separate account books. It would hold in any court. He absorbed this. You've had this for 9 months. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? The question sat between them. Elizabeth looked at him steadily. Because I have been managing the estate's problems for 3 years without telling you, Alexander. Not because I wanted to. Because every time I brought something to your attention, you were on your way somewhere. Or you had just come back from somewhere. Or you told me you were sure I'd handle it. She paused. So I handled it. All of it. And at some point I stopped expecting you to notice. He did not defend himself. She had expected him to, and he didn't. And that was the first surprising thing he had done in 3 years. I heard you, she said, last night, in the drawing room. His jaw tightened. I know. I was in the hallway, she said. I was coming to tell you about Charles. I had the reports in my hand. She looked at her tea. And then I heard what you said to your friends. The garden was very quiet. I need you to understand something, she said, and her voice was even not wavering because she had decided in the dark last night that she was going to say this plainly and without drama, because plain truth was the only kind worth speaking. I am not angry that you forgot about me at a party. I am not hurt by a joke. She looked at him directly. I am telling you that the joke was the first honest thing you've said in public about our marriage in 3 years. Because you have, in every meaningful sense, forgotten me. You have been forgetting me since the 2nd year. And I have been so busy keeping everything running that I let you forget, because it seemed more important to keep the estate alive than to insist on being seen inside it. Alexander stood in the garden with the morning sun coming in hard, and his wife's words doing something to him that no social situation had ever done, making him see himself clearly. The estate survives, Elizabeth said, because I made it survive, and you did not know that. And that is not entirely your fault, because I did not tell you, but it is partly your fault, Alexander, because you did not ask. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he sat down. Not on the bench across from her, on the garden bench beside her. Close, the way he hadn't sat beside her in a very long time. He held the letter in his hands. 31 entries, he said. Yes. In 3 years. Yes. He looked down at the pages. At her handwriting, clear, precise, the handwriting of a woman who had learned that clarity was a form of self-protection. I have been a fool, he said. Yes, she said. He looked at her, and the surprise in his face at her, agreeing so simply, not softening it, not offering him a more comfortable version, was itself something. A man not accustomed to being agreed with about his own failures. What do you want? He said. She looked at him. I want you to read every page of what I gave you, she said. Every entry. I want you to understand what the estate actually is, not what it looks like from the outside. What it actually is. She paused. And then I want you to deal with Charles Henley. Today. Before he moves another dollar. And after that, he said. She picked up her cold tea. After that, she said, I suppose we will see what kind of man you decide to be. She stood up. She walked back toward the house, and Alexander Whitmore sat in the east garden, holding 31 pages of evidence that his wife had been holding his world together while he'd been forgetting she existed. He looked at the first page. He started reading again from the beginning. This time slower. This time with the particular attention of a man who understood finally that he had been absent from the most important room in his life, and that the woman who had kept it running without him was still somehow waiting to see if he was worth staying for. Alexander did not go to breakfast. Robert came to the garden at 8:30 to ask, and Alexander sent him away with a word. He sat with the letter in his hands and the morning moving around him, and he read every page again. Not skimming. Not the way he had always moved through documents that other people prepared for him, the signature-ready scan of a man who trusted that the important things had already been handled. He read the way Elizabeth wrote slowly, precisely, with the full weight of his attention on every line. By the time he finished the second reading, the coffee Robert had left on the garden table had gone cold. He didn't notice. He was on the entry, dated September 1816, the one that read in Elizabeth's clean margins. Identified discrepancy in the eastern quarter. Harvest reporting. Cross-referenced with the Hargrove delivery records. Shortfall of approximately 60 bushels unaccounted for in Henley's summary. Began separate tracking ledger. A separate tracking ledger. She had begun a separate tracking ledger 14 months before she had enough evidence to act. 14 months of quiet parallel documentation kept entirely in her own hand, never mentioned because to mention it would have required explaining why it existed. And explaining why it existed would have required him to understand what she had already been doing for a year before that. He turned to the next entry, then the next. By the time he reached the final page, the line he had already read twice, but which landed differently now, after the full weight of everything preceding it, something had shifted in him that he did not think was going to shift back. Your estate survives because your wife remembered what you forgot. He stood up. He walked into the house. He did not go to the breakfast room. He went to the estate office, the room off the east corridor, that he had always associated with obligation, the room where the accounts lived, and where the correspondence accumulated, and where he now understood Elizabeth had spent significant portions of the past 3 years doing the work that kept his name attached to something worth having. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room. At the desk that had 2 sides, his largely clear, largely performative, and hers covered in the organized accumulation of ongoing work. Her side had a different quality to it. The papers were sorted. The correspondence was filed in a system he had never asked about. There were 3 ledgers on the left side of the desk, each labeled in her handwriting, each representing something she had been tracking that he had not known existed. He walked to her side of the desk. He opened the first ledger. It was the main estate accounts, but annotated in ways he had never seen them annotated before. Margin notes in 2 colors of ink. Red for concerns, black for resolutions. The red marks were always followed within a few pages by black ones. Every problem she had identified had a corresponding solution documented, dated, complete. He closed it. He opened the second ledger. This one was the separate tracking ledger, the one she had begun in September 1816 when she first noticed the discrepancy in the harvest reporting. He read through it with the same slowness he had brought to the letter, and what he found was not the broad strokes of a woman who had noticed something suspicious and reported it. It was the meticulous, patient, month-by-month construction of a case by a woman who understood that suspicion without proof was worthless, and that proof required time and cross-referencing, and the kind of attention to detail that most people were not willing to sustain for 14 months without telling anyone what they were doing. Elizabeth had sustained it. He turned to the most recent entries. The amounts were specific. The dates were specific. The pattern was clear. Charles Henley had been taking from the estate accounts in distributions that were too irregular to appear systematic and too consistent once you tracked them over time to be anything else. The total calculated at the bottom of the most recent page in Elizabeth's handwriting was not a small number. Alexander set the ledger down. He pressed both hands flat on the desk. Then he went to find Charles Henley. Henley kept an office at the south end of the hall, a comfortable room that Alexander had furnished well, because he believed in making his trusted people comfortable, and because comfort, he had always assumed, was its own kind of loyalty. He knocked once and went in without waiting, which he had the right to do, and which he had never done before, because visiting Henley unannounced had simply never occurred to him. Henley handled things. You didn't check on a man who handled things. Henley looked up from his desk with an expression of professional welcome that shifted in the half-second before he controlled it into something that Elizabeth's ledger had taught Alexander to recognize. Calculation. "Mr. Whitmore," Henley said smoothly. "Good morning. I didn't expect—" "Sit down, Charles," Alexander said. Henley was already sitting. He stayed where he was, which meant the instruction had been understood for what it actually was. Alexander set Elizabeth's tracking ledger on the desk between them. He did not open it. He did not need to. He watched Henley's eyes go to it, the instinctive, immediate recognition of a man seeing something he knows exists, but had not expected to be confronted with. "My wife," Alexander said, "has been keeping records." Henley looked up. "Sir, I—" "Don't," Alexander said. "Alexander." The word came out quiet. Very quiet. The kind of quiet that meant every bit of social ease he had been operating on his whole life had been set aside, and what was left underneath it was something older and colder and entirely certain. Henley closed his mouth. "She has 14 months of documentation," Alexander said. "Cross-referenced with the Hargrove records, the Kellner records, the Eastern Quarter harvest reports, and the bank correspondence. The total discrepancy is—" He named the figure. He had memorized it on the walk from the estate office. "You have one opportunity to tell me where it went. After that, I go to the magistrate, and you tell him." The silence in the room lasted 4 seconds. Then Henley's composure broke, not dramatically, not with protestations or tears. It broke the way a man breaks when he has been found completely, and knows it, which is quietly deflating the air, going out of him all at once. "The investment," Henley said. "In the Fredericksburg operation. I intended to return it within—" "You intended," Alexander said. "In whose funds?" Henley did not answer. "My wife's funds," Alexander said. "My estate's funds. The money that paid the men who worked this land and kept the accounts in balance while you were investing it without permission in an operation whose returns you would have kept for yourself." He paused. "Was any of it going to come back?" Henley looked at the desk. That was answer enough. "You have until noon," Alexander said, "to produce a full accounting of every dollar. Then you will leave this property. I will decide by tomorrow whether we go to the magistrate or whether the full repayment you're going to arrange in the next 24 hours constitutes a sufficient settlement." He picked up the ledger. "My wife built this case over 14 months, Charles. 14 months of watching you and saying nothing because she was waiting until the documentation was complete." He paused at the door. "Whatever you think of her position in this house, understand that she is the reason this conversation is happening with a ledger instead of a sheriff." He walked out. He stood in the corridor for a moment. His hands were not entirely steady. Not with anger, or not only with anger, with the particular unsteadiness of a man who has just done something clearly right for the first time in a long time, and is feeling simultaneously exactly how much time was spent not doing it. He needed to tell Elizabeth. He found her in the small sitting room off the library, not the formal parlor, but the room she actually used, the one she had quietly furnished over 3 years, into something that reflected her rather than the Whitmore family's inherited aesthetic. Bookcases along 2 walls. A writing table near the window. A chair that had been reupholstered in a deep green that Alexander had noticed once and never commented on. She was writing a letter when he came in. She looked up. "Henley," he said. "I spoke with him." Her pen stilled. "He didn't deny it," Alexander said. "He's producing a full accounting by noon. I told him he was to leave the property today." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. Reading him, he realized the way she had always been reading him, the way he had never noticed because he had not been paying attention. "You went alone," she said. "Without a lawyer, without a witness." "Yes, that was—" She paused. "That was either very brave or very unwise." "It was probably both," he said. "I will have the lawyer here by noon when he produces the accounting. That part I'm handling correctly." He paused. "I wanted to go in first myself." "Why?" He looked at her. "Because you spent 14 months building that case without anyone standing behind you," he said. "The least I could do was walk into the room without needing someone to hold my hand." Something shifted in her face. Not warmth exactly, not yet too much still between them for warmth to move freely, but something that was not the closed, careful distance she had been carrying all morning. She looked down at the letter she had been writing. "The Fredericksburg investment," she said. "What did he say about it?" "He claims he intended to return the funds. The returns would have been his." "I know," she said. I suspected that from the beginning, but couldn't confirm it until 3 months ago, when I found the correspondence with the Fredericksburg operation in the files. She paused. He had used a variant spelling of his own name. Probably thought no one would connect it. Alexander stared at her. You found correspondence. Under H misfiled from C, she said, which tells you something about how confident he was that no one was looking. She set her pen down. The Fredericksburg operation incidentally failed 6 months ago. Whatever he invested is likely gone, which means the repayment is going to require him to find funds from somewhere else. You knew the investment had failed. I read the commercial reports from Fredericksburg in the Courier, she said simply. It was in the October edition. He sat down, not across from her in the chair nearest to her, which put him close enough that she could have reached across and touched his arm if she'd wanted to. She didn't. But he sat there because it felt like the honest position. Close enough to be present. No more distance between them than was necessary. Elizabeth, he said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me plainly. I have been answering you plainly all morning, she said. I don't intend to stop. How much have I missed? He said. Not the accounts, not Henley. How much of the actual running of this house, this estate, the decisions that needed to be made? How much has been happening without my knowledge? She looked at him. All of it, she said. He absorbed this. The staff, she said. Every hiring decision in the past 2 years has been mine. Robert came to me about the kitchen situation in April of last year. Do you know what the kitchen situation in April of last year was? No, he said. Mrs. Greer, the cook, had a sister in difficult circumstances in Charlottesville. She was going to leave. She told Robert, not me. She was worried about telling me directly. Robert told me. I went to speak with her. We arranged a small adjustment to her wages and a room for her sister in the servants' quarters when she comes to visit twice a year. She paused. Mrs. Greer has stayed. She is excellent. Your guests last night ate food prepared by a woman who almost left because no one in a position to help her knew her name. He was quiet. The tenants on the south quarter, she continued, not with heat. She was not performing grievance. She was doing what she said, answering plainly. The Marsh family. Their oldest son broke his leg in February. They were 3 weeks from being unable to make their rent payment. I arranged for the estate to defer their payment 6 weeks with no penalty, and sent Robert with a supply of preserved goods from the kitchen stores. She paused. You passed Mr. Marsh at the fence 2 weeks ago. He tipped his hat to you with a great deal of feeling. Do you remember? I remember, Alexander said. He was thanking you, she said, for something you did not do. The sitting room was very quiet. I am not telling you this to make you feel small, Elizabeth said. She looked at him directly, and her eyes had the quality he was learning to recognize. Not anger, not bitterness, but the absolute, unadorned honesty of a woman who had decided she was done protecting him from clear information. I am telling you because you asked. You asked how much you missed. This is how much you missed. I know, he said. Do you? I am beginning to, he said. I don't think I knew this morning. I think I am knowing it now, and I expect I will know it more thoroughly as we go. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen. The Kellner correspondence needs a response by Friday, she said. I've been managing the relationship, but some of the terms of the autumn contract need a decision about the Western Quarter allocation that technically requires your signature and your stated preference. He blinked. The shift from the personal to the practical was so swift and so complete that for a second he simply watched it happen. All right, he said. Tell me what I need to know. She looked up from the letter she was writing. You want to understand it, she said. Not skeptical, genuinely asking. I want to understand all of it, he said. From the beginning, the accounts, the contracts, the tenant arrangements, the staff situations. Everything you have been managing. He paused. I am aware this is considerably overdue. She studied him, reading him again, that careful, thorough reading that had always been happening and that he had never noticed because he had not been paying attention to being read. This afternoon, she said finally. After Henley's accounting is received and the lawyer has reviewed it, I will take you through the estate records from the beginning. I'll be there, he said. You have said that before, she said. Not cruelly, just plainly. He looked at her. I know, he said. I will be there. She nodded once. She went back to her letter. He sat in the chair that was close enough to be present for a moment longer, and then he stood and went to manage Charles Henley, and for the first time in 3 years, he walked through his own house with the particular quality of attention of a man who understood that everything he was walking through had been held together by someone he had not been seeing. He saw it now. He saw all of it. And the thing that had happened in his chest in the garden that morning, the thing without a clean name that was cold and clarifying and not entirely comfortable, was still there, settling in, making itself at home in the space where his easy, uncomplicated confidence used to live. Good, some part of him thought. It should stay. Henley produced the accounting at 5 minutes past noon. He sat across from Alexander and the lawyer, a Mr. Pritchard, who had done business with the Whitmore estate for 15 years, and he placed a document on the table that was either a complete accounting or the best imitation of one he could manage under pressure. Pritchard reviewed it with the slow, thorough patience of a man who had learned never to trust a number without checking the addition. Elizabeth was not in the room. She had chosen not to be, which Alexander had not understood at first, and then had. She had built the case. She had done the work that made this moment possible. She did not need to sit in the room and watch it conclude to know what it meant. And her absence from the room was its own kind of statement, the same statement she had been making for 3 years quietly, without announcement. I do not need to be seen to have been here. Pritchard finished his review. The figures are consistent with Mrs. Whitmore's documentation, he said, and the way he said Mrs. Whitmore with a particular emphasis, the weight of a man acknowledging something that surprised him, told Alexander that Pritchard had reviewed Elizabeth's tracking ledger and understood exactly what it represented. Complete, Alexander said. As far as I can determine, Pritchard said. I would want a week to cross-reference against the bank records fully, but the broad numbers align. Alexander looked at Henley. Full repayment, he said. 30 days. If the funds are not received by the estate, in 30 days, Mr. Pritchard takes this to the magistrate. Is that understood? Henley, who had said very little since the morning, nodded. In writing, Pritchard said. Before you leave this room. Henley signed. He left Whitmore Hall at 2:30. Alexander stood at the window of the estate office and watched the carriage go. He felt something, not satisfaction exactly. Something more complicated. The awareness of a problem solved that should have been solved months ago by him if he had been paying attention to his own affairs. The knowledge that the solving had been done by his wife in silence over 14 months while he attended parties and fox hunts and card evenings and called himself a man of substance. He heard the door of the estate office open. Elizabeth came in. She stood beside him at the window and watched the carriage until it was gone. He signed, she said. He signed. 30 days full repayment. Pritchard is thorough, she said. He'll track it. I know. He paused. He said the figures were consistent with your documentation. I know they are, she said, without vanity, simply. Alexander turned from the window. I owe you an apology, he said. She looked at him. Not for last night, he said. Last night was the thing that made me see it. But the apology is not for a joke at a party. He paused, choosing his words with more care than he was accustomed to taking. I owe you an apology for 3 years of assuming that the things you were managing were being managed by some process, some automatic function of the household. Not by a person who was spending her own time and intelligence on my behalf and getting nothing from me in return except absence. Elizabeth looked at him for a long time. That is a better apology than I expected, she said. Is it enough? He said. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. But it is a beginning. He nodded. He had not expected it to be enough. He had not earned enough yet for it to be enough. This afternoon, he said. The estate records. You said you would take me through them. I did say that, she said. I'll be there, he said. "I will actually be there." She looked at him, and then she did something he had not seen her do in a long time. Something unguarded. Something that came from somewhere beneath the careful composure she had been carrying all day. She pressed her lips together briefly and looked away, and when she looked back, her eyes were steady, but there was something in them that was not quite closed anymore. "The records are on my side of the desk," she said. "I'll make room for you." He understood what she meant. All of it. Not just the physical space on the desk. "Thank you," he said. She walked out ahead of him. He followed. And that evening, for the first time in 3 years, Alexander Whitmore sat at the estate desk, his wife's side of it, in the chair she had pulled out for him, and began to learn what it actually meant to be the man whose name was on the gate. Elizabeth sat across from him. She opened the first ledger. She began to explain. He listened. He listened in a way he had never listened before, not waiting for the summary, not looking for the moment when he could delegate not performing attention, while actually calculating how soon he could be somewhere more comfortable. He listened with both hands on the table, and his eyes on the pages she was showing him, and his whole self present in the room. She noticed. He could see her noticing the slight recalibration of how she was speaking to him, the way the explanation became slightly more detailed, as she recognized that the detail was being received. They worked until the candles burned low, and somewhere in the 3rd hour, Elizabeth asked him a question about the Western Quarter allocation, a question that required him to make an actual decision, not sign off on hers. And he thought about it for a moment and gave her an answer. And she looked at the answer, considered it, said, "That would work. That might actually work better than what I'd been planning," and wrote it into the margin. Not his decision being absorbed into her silent management. Her work and his thought together on the same page. He did not say anything about it, but he felt it, the difference. And what Charlotte Pembroke was doing 20 miles away in Richmond, preparing for the next season's social gatherings, and certain that the Whitmore estate's difficulties were an open secret that would serve her purposes in time. Charlotte did not yet know that the woman she had always dismissed as merely a clever addition to Alexander's drawing room had been running that estate alone for 3 years, and had just decided for the first time to let her husband stand beside her while she did it. That would turn out to be Charlotte's most significant miscalculation. But that reckoning was still coming, for now the candles burned low in the estate office of Whitmore Hall, and 2 people sat on the same side of a desk for the first time, and outside the Virginia summer held its heat against the darkness, and inside something was being built that had not existed the night before. Something real, something that would not be easily undone. The 30 days of Henley's repayment deadline passed with a quiet that Alexander had learned in the weeks since the letter to be suspicious of. Not from Elizabeth. Elizabeth's quiet had always been purposeful, the quiet of a woman thinking, working, deciding. He was learning to read the difference between her silence that meant "I am processing something" and her silence that meant "I have already processed it and am waiting for you to catch up." Both were productive. Both were hers. He had simply never been close enough to distinguish between them before. The quiet he was suspicious of came from outside the hall. Richmond had not responded to Henley's departure with the indifference Alexander had hoped for. He had not announced it, had not made any public statement, had simply ended the professional relationship, and allowed the fact of Henley's absence to be absorbed into the general understanding of those who paid attention to such things. He had assumed, in the way he had always assumed, social things would resolve themselves, that a quiet removal would produce a quiet response. He had underestimated Charlotte Pembroke's network. The first indication came from James Rawlings, one of Alexander's oldest friends, a man who appeared at Whitmore Hall on a Thursday morning with the expression of someone delivering a message he had not volunteered for. Alexander met him in the front hall. "James, I wasn't expecting you." "I know," Rawlings said. He looked uncomfortable in a way that was unusual for him. Rawlings was a man who moved through social situations the way water moved through a channel, easily and without friction. The friction on his face now was visible. "I came because I thought you should hear it from someone who isn't enjoying it." "Hear what?" Alexander said. "Charlotte Pembroke has been talking," Rawlings said. "About Henley, about why he left." He paused. "About Elizabeth." Alexander went still, What about Elizabeth? Rawlings sat down without being asked, which meant Alexander registered that what was coming required the stability of a chair. Charlotte is saying that Henley left because Elizabeth drove him out, that she had been undermining him for months, interfering with the estate's business, overstepping her position, making his work impossible. He stopped. She is also saying that Henley's departure has destabilized the estate's finances, and that several of your trading partners are reconsidering their arrangements because they no longer have confidence in the management. Alexander looked at his friend for a long moment. "And where is Charlotte getting this?" he said. "Henley," Rawlings said simply. Of course, a man who had been removed with a signed agreement and a 30-day repayment deadline had a choice. He could go quietly and return the money, or he could go loudly and attempt to construct an alternative narrative before the truth reached the right ears. Henley had apparently chosen the latter, which told Alexander that the repayment was going to be a problem. A man who intended to pay didn't need a story. A man who needed a story was a man who had already decided he wasn't paying. "There's more," Rawlings said. "Tell me." "Charlotte is hosting a gathering next Friday. The Morrison family will be there. The Caldwells, the Pendletons." Rawlings looked at him steadily. "She has let it be known that the state of the Whitmore estate's finances will be a topic of discussion, in the context of whether certain business associations should be reconsidered." Alexander understood what this meant. Charlotte wasn't attacking Elizabeth directly. She had tried that approach during the courtship, and it had failed. She was attacking the estate. She was using Henley's manufactured narrative to seed doubt about the management of Whitmore Hall at a moment when Richmond's business community would be assembled in one room, and she was doing it with the particular elegance of a woman who had learned to make her weapons look like concern. "She wants to embarrass the estate," Alexander said. "She wants to embarrass Elizabeth," Rawlings said quietly. "The estate is the mechanism." Alexander sat down. Rawlings watched him. "What are you going to do?" Alexander thought about the past 3 weeks, about the evenings at the desk going through the ledgers with Elizabeth, about the Kellner contract revision which had been finalized 4 days ago at terms better than the previous arrangement, about the Western Quarter timber allocation, which Elizabeth had spent a week modeling on paper, and which Alexander had reviewed and approved, and which 2 separate buyers had already expressed interest in. About the Marsh family on the South Quarter, whose rent deferral Alexander had formally documented, and whose story he now knew, because Elizabeth had told him specifically, because he had asked her specifically, to tell him the things he didn't know. He thought about 31 entries. Then he said, "I am going to Charlotte's gathering." Rawlings stared at him. "Alexander, and Elizabeth is coming with me." Rawlings was quiet for a beat. Then, "She knows about the gathering." "She will," Alexander said. "I am going to tell her this afternoon." He stood. "James, thank you for coming." Rawlings stood too. He looked at Alexander with an expression that was trying to calibrate something. "You seem," he started, stopped. "Different," Alexander said. "Yes, I am," Alexander said, "considerably." He went to find Elizabeth. She was in the estate office. She was always in the estate office in the mornings, now sometimes alone, sometimes with Alexander, and the difference between those 2 versions of the mornings had become one of the things Alexander measured his days by. The mornings with Elizabeth in the estate office with him were better mornings. He had not told her this yet. He was not sure he had earned the right to say it. She looked up when he came in. He told her everything Rawlings had said. He did not soften it. He had learned in the past 3 weeks that softening things for Elizabeth was both unnecessary and counterproductive. She received plain information better than comfortable versions, processed it faster, and trusted the person delivering it more. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Henley isn't going to repay." "No," he said. "I don't think he is. He's building a narrative instead," she said. "If he can establish that his departure was Elizabeth's fault, the unreasonable wife interfering in estate affairs, then the repayment becomes a negotiating position. He can say that whatever he took was fair compensation for an impossible working situation. Can he make that argument hold? Alexander said. To people who want to believe it, yes. She looked at him steadily. To a court, no. The documentation is complete. Then we go to the magistrate, he said. We stop waiting for the repayment and we go directly. She looked at him. Something moved in her face, the same recalibration he had been seeing since the morning in the garden. The small adjustments her expression made when he said something that did not match what she had expected. That would mean making the full accounting public, she said. I know. Everything in my tracking ledger becomes part of the court record, she said. What Henley took, how I found it, how long I was watching him. She paused. Why it took me 14 months to bring it forward. He understood what she was saying. If the tracking ledger became court record, it would tell the full story, including the part that reflected on him. The part that showed that his wife had been doing his work for 3 years and had discovered a significant fraud that he had not known about because he had not been present enough to know. I know, he said again. That story will not be comfortable for you, she said. No, he agreed. It won't be. She looked at him for a long time. Alexander, she said, you understand what I am saying. If this goes to court, the record will show that I forgot I had a wife, he said, and that my wife, while I was forgetting, ran the estate, caught the fraud, built the case, and handed it to me already complete. He held her gaze. I know. I'm telling you to go to the magistrate anyway. The office was very still. You're telling me, she said slowly, to take this public, knowing what it will show. I'm telling you that the truth is more important than my comfort, he said, and that Henley should not profit from a narrative designed to protect him at your expense. He paused. You spent 14 months building that case. I am not going to sit here and let him dismantle it with a story he told Charlotte Pembroke over dinner. Elizabeth looked down at the desk. Then she looked up. Pritchard, she said. We need Pritchard today. I'll send for him this morning. And Charlotte's gathering on Friday, she said. You said you wanted to attend. We, he said. I said we. She absorbed that word, the same way she had absorbed together from him 3 weeks ago carefully, without rushing toward it. We will need to be prepared, she said. Tell me what we need, he said. She reached for the tracking ledger. Sit down, she said. We have work to do. Pritchard arrived by 2 o'clock. He was a careful man, the kind of lawyer who said less than he knew, and knew considerably more than anyone expected, and he listened to Alexander's decision to proceed to the magistrate with the expression of a man confirming something he had already considered. The documentation is sufficient, Pritchard said. He had Elizabeth's tracking ledger open in front of him the same way he had reviewed it during the Henley accounting. In fact, it is more than sufficient. In 30 years of practice, I have rarely seen private documentation this thorough. Elizabeth said nothing. She had a quality in this room of being present without performing presence. She sat straight, she listened. She spoke when she had something to add, and was quiet when she didn't. Pritchard, Alexander noticed, addressed himself slightly more often to her than to Alexander, which was a fact Pritchard probably wasn't consciously aware of, and which told Alexander something about where the authority in this room actually lived. There is one complication, Pritchard said. Tell me, Alexander said. Henley has been speaking to Thomas Caldwell, Pritchard said. Henry Caldwell's brother. Thomas is a justice of the peace in the Western District. He looked at them both. If Henley has been building his narrative with Thomas Caldwell, as well as Charlotte Pembroke, we may find that the magistrate's office is less immediately receptive than it might otherwise be. Elizabeth spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. Thomas Caldwell owes the Whitmore estate a debt. Both men looked at her. March of last year, she said to Alexander specifically. The Caldwell family's Southfield lease. They were 3 months behind. I extended the arrangement without penalty and did not report the arrears to the lending institution that held the lease as collateral. If I had Thomas Caldwell's brother would have faced a very unpleasant conversation with his bank. She paused. I did not do it to create leverage. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because the Caldwells had been good tenants for 12 years. She looked at Pritchard. But Thomas Caldwell knows what I did. He wrote me a personal letter. I have it. Pritchard was quiet for a moment. You have it? In the correspondence file, she said. Third shelf C. Alexander looked at his wife. At the woman who had filed a personal letter from a justice of the peace in a third shelf correspondence file 14 months ago, while managing an estate and tracking a fraud and running a household and being forgotten at dinner parties. He had married someone extraordinary. He had simply never been paying attention. Bring it to the magistrate's office, Pritchard said. Not as a threat, simply as context for the relationship. He closed the ledger. I will file the initial documentation tomorrow morning. Henley will be served by end of week. Before Charlotte's gathering, Elizabeth said. Pritchard looked at her. Yes, assuming the filing goes smoothly. Is that timing significant? Yes, she said. Pritchard looked between them. I won't ask, he said. Wise, Elizabeth said. He left at 4 o'clock. Elizabeth went back to the desk and opened the correspondence file. Not the tracking ledger, a different file, the one she used for ongoing business, and began drafting something. Alexander stayed in his chair and watched her work for a moment, which was something he had been doing with increasing frequency, and which she had not yet told him to stop. What are you writing? He said. Letters to the Kellner operation and the 2 timber buyers, she said. Confirming our arrangements for the autumn season, in your name and mine. She did not look up. If Henley's story reaches them before our letters do, we lose the advantage. If our letters arrive first with specifics and confirmed terms, the story has nothing to attach to. You thought of this before Pritchard left, he said. I thought of it this morning, she said. When Rawlings was still in the hall and you hadn't come to tell me yet. He stared at her. How did you know Rawlings was here? I heard his horse, she said. James Rawlings always comes fast and stops hard, and he never comes on a weekday morning unless something has happened. She looked up briefly. I have been listening to this house for 3 years, Alexander. I know every sound in it. He had nothing to say to that. He picked up a pen. Tell me what to write, he said. She looked at him. The recalibration again, and this time it went further than before. Something in her face moved past the careful assessment and touched something more personal. Briefly, just for a moment. Then she turned back to her letter and began to dictate. He wrote, Friday arrived the way Fridays arrived when something was coming faster than the days before it and slower than it felt like it should be. Charlotte's gathering was at 8 o'clock. The filing with the magistrate had gone through on Thursday morning, as Pritchard had promised. Henley had been served Thursday afternoon. Charlotte did not yet know, but she would know by Friday evening, because Richmond moved information the way Richmond always moved information, through the specific network of drawing rooms and calling cards, and carefully placed remarks that Charlotte herself had built over 20 years. Elizabeth dressed for the evening without calling her maid. Alexander found her in her room. He knocked, which he had begun doing 3 weeks ago, which was one of those small recalibrations that neither of them had named, and she was standing at her mirror, pinning the last of her hair in a dark blue dress that was neither elaborate nor modest, simply right. The dress of a woman who had dressed for her own reasons rather than anyone else's. You look, he started. Don't, she said, not unkindly. Not tonight. Say it another time when it isn't attached to something we are about to walk into. He closed his mouth. Then he said, Fair enough. She looked at him in the mirror. Are you ready? I've been ready since Thursday morning, he said. She turned from the mirror and looked at him directly in the way she always looked at him now. The full, honest look that had taken him a month to learn not to flinch from, because being seen clearly was something he had not been doing for a long time, and it was not entirely comfortable. Not because she judged, because she saw. This is going to be difficult, she said. I know, Charlotte will have positioned everything carefully. Henley's narrative will be in place. We will walk in, and several people in that room will have already decided what they think happened. I know, he said. We walk in anyway. She nodded. She picked up her gloves. They walked out together. Charlotte's gathering was at the Pembroke Estate, the largest private home in the Richmond social circuit, decorated with the aggressive good taste of a woman who understood that every surface was a statement. The rooms were full by the time Alexander and Elizabeth arrived, which was by design on both sides. Charlotte had expected them to arrive early, and Elizabeth had known that, and had suggested they arrive 20 minutes after the hour, which gave everyone enough time to be present and paying attention before they walked in. The effect of their entrance was immediate and visible, not because they announced themselves, because the room knew something that half of it had been told and half of it hadn't, and the arrival of both Alexander and Elizabeth together, which was itself notable for a couple that Richmond had not been accustomed to seeing together, created the particular stillness of a room waiting to understand what was happening. Charlotte appeared from the center of the room. She was composed in the way that Charlotte was always composed, thoroughly deliberately, with the practiced ease of a woman who had been managing social situations since she was 16 years old. She looked at Alexander first, then at Elizabeth, and something moved behind her eyes that she controlled before it reached her face. "Alexander," she said warmly, "and Elizabeth, how lovely." "Charlotte," Alexander said. "Thank you for the invitation. Of course." Her smile was exactly right, welcoming, slightly concerned, the expression of a friend who had heard troubling things and was reserving judgment. "We were all so sorry to hear about the difficulties at Whitmore Hall. Losing Henley after so many years must have been—" "Charles Henley," Alexander said in a voice pitched to carry without appearing to be pitched to carry, a skill Elizabeth had once thought entirely wasted on social performances, was removed from the Whitmore Estate service following the discovery of a significant financial fraud. "The documentation has been filed with the magistrate's office as of Thursday morning. He has been served." The room went very, very still. Charlotte's smile stayed in place, but the confidence behind it changed quality she had not known about the filing. Henley had not told her, which meant Henley had been managing his narrative without giving Charlotte the full picture, and Charlotte had built her evening on a foundation that had just been pulled out from under her. "That's—" Charlotte started. "The documentation," Elizabeth said, stepping forward beside Alexander. Not in front of him, not behind him. Beside him, the way she had been standing since they arrived, was compiled over 14 months. Complete account records cross-referenced with 3 independent sources. Mr. Pritchard reviewed it. It will hold. Several faces in the room were doing rapid recalculations. The Kellner representative, who Elizabeth had spotted near the window the moment they came in, had straightened visibly. James Rawlings, standing near the fireplace, caught Alexander's eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Mrs. Morrison, who had come in from the right side of the room during Charlotte's opening line, was watching Elizabeth with an expression that was not surprised and was very nearly satisfied. Henry Caldwell said from somewhere near the back, "Henley told Thomas it was mismanagement, that Elizabeth had—" "Henley told your brother what served Henley's interests," Alexander said. He turned slightly, not dramatically, not with performance, simply turning to address the question. "What the documents show is that the estate's finances are sound, that several significant trading arrangements have been strengthened in the past month, and that the Western Quarter is under a new timber arrangement that will add materially to the estate's income beginning in autumn." He paused. These developments did not happen in spite of Elizabeth's involvement in the estate's management. They happened because of it, Charlotte said carefully. "Alexander, you don't need to—" "I'm not finished," he said. The room was entirely still now. "I owe several people in this room an honest account," Alexander said. "Not because I enjoy making one, but because the alternative is allowing a dishonest account to stand, and I find I am no longer willing to do that." He looked around the room at the faces that had heard the joke at his party 3 weeks ago, and laughed at the faces that had heard Henley's story, and absorbed it at the faces that were now watching him, with the particular attention of people who understood that something real was happening. 3 years ago, I handed my wife the management of an estate that needed more attention than I was giving it. She took that responsibility seriously, in ways I did not know and did not ask about. She kept the estate solvent protected. Its trading relationships, managed its staff and its tenants, and caught a fraud that cost us considerably less than it would have because she had been watching for 14 months before I knew there was anything to watch. He stopped. I told a room full of people 3 weeks ago that I had forgotten I had a wife. His voice was even. No performance in it. If anything, the lack of performance was what gave it weight. I did not say that to be cruel. I said it because it was in a meaningful sense true. I had been forgetting. Every day for 3 years I had been forgetting. He looked at Elizabeth, not performing the look, simply looking at her the way he had been learning to look at her. I don't intend to forget again. The room held its breath. Then Mrs. Morrison said from the right in her calm and entirely unrattleable voice, "The Kellner arrangement you mentioned, Elizabeth, is that the same James Kellner whose father corresponded with the Richmond Courier?" Elizabeth turned to her. "His son, yes. We re-established the relationship in August." "Better terms than the father's original," Mrs. Morrison said. "Considerably," Elizabeth said. Mrs. Morrison nodded. She looked at Charlotte. "I believe you mentioned earlier that the Whitmore estate's trading relationships were in question," she said pleasantly. "It appears that has been resolved." Charlotte said nothing, which was in its way the loudest thing she had said all evening. The gathering continued around them. Conversations resumed, shifted, recalibrated. The Kellner representative moved toward Alexander and Elizabeth within 10 minutes and shook both their hands and said that he looked forward to the autumn delivery. Rawlings appeared at Alexander's shoulder and said very quietly, "Well done." Henry Caldwell looked conflicted, the expression of a man who had told his brother something that turned out to be wrong and was calculating the social cost. But he crossed the room to them and said stiffly that he was glad to hear the estate was in order. Charlotte did not approach them again. She moved through her own gathering with the composed efficiency of a woman managing a situation that had not gone as planned, because Charlotte was never without a plan, and the secondary plan was already in motion behind her eyes. She was not finished. Elizabeth knew this. She did not need to look at Charlotte to know it. She simply knew the way she knew the sounds of the hall, the way she knew the pattern in Henley's accounts. Charlotte Pembroke did not concede. She retreated and recalculated and came back at a different angle. But tonight in this room in front of these people, the narrative had shifted. Not because Alexander had made a grand speech, not because Elizabeth had displayed her documentation, but because two people had walked into a room together and stood on the same side of a thing in public, and that simple act had changed what the room understood about Whitmore Hall and the people who ran it. They left at 9:30. Not early appropriately timed the exit of people who had come for a purpose and had achieved it and were not lingering to perform. In the carriage going home they were quiet for a while. Then Elizabeth said, "You didn't tell me you were going to say all of that." "I didn't know exactly what I was going to say until I said it," Alexander said. "Was that—" He paused. "Did I speak out of turn about your role in the estate?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "It was accurate." "I wanted it to be accurate," he said. "Not generous. Accurate." She was quiet for a moment. "It was both." He looked at her in the carriage's dim light. "Charlotte isn't finished," Elizabeth said. "I know. She's going to come at this differently next time." "I know that too." He paused. "What do you think she'll do?" Elizabeth looked out the window at the Virginia night moving past them. She was thinking he could tell the difference now between her silences. This was the thinking one. "She'll try to get to you directly," Elizabeth said. "She's failed twice by going after me. The dinner invitation, the narrative about the estate. Both times the angle was me." She paused. "Next time it will be you. She'll try to separate us, convince you that I have overstepped, that the public declaration tonight embarrassed you rather than defending me." She turned back to him. "She'll find someone to deliver the message for her, someone you trust." "Rawlings," he said. "No. Rawlings came to warn you. That means he's chosen." She thought for another moment. Caldwell. Henry. He's uncomfortable and he owes his brother an explanation, and he's been friends with you long enough to feel entitled to a private conversation about your marriage. Alexander absorbed this. And when he comes... Elizabeth looked at him steadily. That, she said, depends entirely on what you say to him. It was not a test exactly. She was not testing him. She had said weeks ago that she was done protecting him from clear information, and this was clear information. He would be approached. He would be given a comfortable exit from the position he had taken tonight. A way to make it all a misunderstanding, a momentary overstatement, a husband being protective rather than a husband acknowledging the truth. The question was whether he would take it. He looked at his wife. "Then I'll know what to say," he said. She held his gaze. Then she looked back out the window, but her hand resting on the seat between them moved slightly, not toward him exactly, but not away. He placed his hand beside hers, not taking it, just there, close enough to be present. She did not pull away. The carriage rolled on through the Virginia night toward Whitmore Hall, toward the desk with both their names on its work and both their handwriting in its margins, toward the thing they were building that had not existed 6 weeks ago, and that no one outside that carriage could yet fully see. Charlotte Pembroke was not finished, but then neither were they. Henry Caldwell came on Monday morning. Elizabeth had predicted it would be Monday. She had not said this to Alexander, had simply mentioned in passing on Saturday evening while they were reviewing the Kellner correspondence together that she expected a visit from someone before the middle of the week. Alexander had understood what she meant. He had nodded. He had not asked more. But when Robert came to the estate office and said that Mr. Henry Caldwell had called and was waiting in the front hall, Alexander looked across the desk at Elizabeth, and she looked back at him with the particular steadiness of a woman who had already run this calculation and was waiting to see if her answer was right. "Do you want to be here?" he said. She considered it. "No," she said. "I want you to handle it, but I want you to tell me exactly what was said when it's done." "I will," he said. She went back to the correspondence she was reading. He went to the front hall. Henry Caldwell had the decency to look uncomfortable. He was a large man, broad, well-fed, the body of someone who had never worried about where the next meal was coming from, and discomfort sat oddly on him like a coat cut for a smaller person. "Alexander," he said, "I hope this isn't a bad time." "Come in," Alexander said, and led him to the small sitting room off the library, rather than the estate office, which was a deliberate choice. The estate office was Elizabeth's territory, now in the way that mattered, her work on every surface, her systems in every shelf. He was not bringing Henry Caldwell into that room. They sat. "Friday night," Caldwell said without much preamble. He was not a man for extended approach when he had something to say. "What you said about Elizabeth." "What about it?" Alexander said. "Some people felt it was perhaps more than the situation required." Caldwell shifted in his chair. "You were very public about things that are generally considered private family matters." "I made a public statement about my wife's contribution to our estate," Alexander said, "at a gathering where that contribution was being publicly misrepresented. I matched the scale of my response to the scale of the attack." Caldwell frowned. "No one was attacking. Henry." Alexander's voice did not rise. It simply stopped being accommodating. "Your brother is a justice of the peace who received a private account from Charles Henley, a man who defrauded the Whitmore estate of a significant sum designed to make that fraud appear to be my wife's fault. The account reached Charlotte Pembroke, who built an evening around it. I responded to what was actually happening." He paused. "What specifically did you come here to tell me?" Caldwell looked at him. He recalibrated the slight shift of a man who had come prepared for a different conversation and was finding the ground had changed. "People are saying," Caldwell said carefully, "that Elizabeth is that the situation at the estate is unusual. A wife managing accounts, handling trade negotiations, dealing directly with legal matters." He paused. "It raises questions." "What kind of questions?" "About who is actually running Whitmore Hall," Caldwell said. He said it as plainly as he was capable of saying anything. and whether that is appropriate. Alexander looked at his old friend, at the man he had hunted with and played cards with and shared easy evenings with for 15 years. At the man who had laughed in the drawing room at the party and had never not once in those 15 years asked Alexander a single question about how the estate actually functioned, what the accounts looked like, who managed the staff, how the trading relationships were maintained. None of it. Because those things were managed somehow by someone, and that was sufficient. Elizabeth is running Whitmore Hall, Alexander said. She has been running it for 3 years. I was not paying adequate attention to my own affairs, and she stepped into that gap and kept the estate solvent and growing, and she did it without acknowledgement or assistance. He met Caldwell's eyes. That is what actually happened. I was not defrauded by my wife. I was protected by her. Caldwell was quiet. What people find unusual, Alexander continued, is that a woman was capable of it. That is not a problem with Elizabeth. That is a problem with people's assumptions. He paused. I shared those assumptions, Henry, for 3 years. I am not sharing them anymore. Caldwell sat with this for a moment. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had never been required to examine certain things, which was different. The examination was happening now visibly on his face. Charlotte believes, he started. Charlotte, Alexander said, is not the measure of what I should believe about my own marriage. He stood. Tell your brother that the magistrate's filing stands. Henley will be held accountable. And tell him that the account Henley gave him was self-serving and incomplete. Caldwell stood too. He looked at Alexander, really looked at him the way you looked at a person when you were realizing they had become someone you didn't entirely recognize. You've changed, Caldwell said. Yes, Alexander said simply. Since the party. Since before the party, Alexander said. I just didn't know it until the morning after. Caldwell left. Alexander stood in the sitting room for a moment after the door closed. He thought about what Caldwell had said, about who is actually running Whitmore Hall. The way it had been said as a concern, as a question of appropriateness, as the kind of thing that decent people were supposed to find troubling. And he recognized with a clarity that had been building in him for a month that he had asked himself the same question implicitly for 3 years, and had been grateful for the answer every single time, without acknowledging that the answer was Elizabeth. He went back to the estate office. She looked up when he came in. She read his face the things she did quickly and accurately, and which he no longer tried to prevent. He came to suggest you had overstepped, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he said. He asked who was actually running Whitmore Hall. And what did you say? I told him you were, Alexander said, and that I was grateful for it. Elizabeth looked at him. Something moved in her face that was more than the careful recalibrations of the past month. Something that reached further back to a woman who had been solving things in silence for 3 years and had learned not to expect acknowledgement because expectation without basis was a thing you couldn't afford. She looked down at the desk. Pritchard sent a note this morning, she said. Her voice was even. The magistrate's office has confirmed receipt of the filing. Henley has 14 days to respond before the formal proceedings begin. Good, Alexander said. There's something else in Pritchard's note. She picked it up. He says that in reviewing the full estate documents for the filing, he found a secondary discrepancy. Not Henley's accounts, a different set. Alexander went still. What kind of discrepancy? She handed him the note. He read it. Then he read it again. The estate's deed records, he said. The Western Quarter. Yes, Elizabeth said. Pritchard is saying the deed for the Western Quarter has a secondary notation, a lien. Filed. He looked at the date. 6 years ago. Before we were married, Elizabeth said. Before you inherited. She paused. Your father's signature. The room was very quiet. Alexander set the note down. His father had died 4 years ago, 2 years before the situation with the accounts had begun to unravel, but 2 years after the lien had apparently been filed. A lien that had never appeared in the estate records as Alexander understood them. A lien that Henley, who had been managing the estate's affairs at the time, would have known about. Henley knew, Alexander said. Almost certainly, Elizabeth said. Which means he may have been planning his exit longer than we thought. If the lien is valid and the Western Quarter can't be used as the basis for the timber contract, the autumn arrangement falls through, Alexander said. Or has to be restructured significantly, Elizabeth said. The buyers committed based on our representation of clear title to the timber rights. She was already reaching for the filing cabinet. I need to see the original deed documents, the ones from before our marriage. Pritchard will need them too. They're in the strong room, Alexander said. My father's papers. She paused. You have the key. I'll get it, he said. He was out of the office and down the corridor to the strong room, a locked room at the back of the hall that had been his father's domain, and that Alexander had opened perhaps 3 times since inheriting, because Henley had always managed whatever was in it, and Alexander had never questioned that, and his hand was on the lock when he stopped. Henley had always managed whatever was in it. He unlocked the door. He went in. He stood in a room full of his father's papers. His grandfather's papers, 60 years of Whitmore estate history in boxes and ledgers and folders, and he understood with a coldness that settled into him bone deep that he had never been in this room long enough to know what was here. That Henley had been the keeper of this room for 8 years. He found the deed file. He brought it back to the estate office. Elizabeth had cleared the desk by the time he returned, pushed everything to the side, made space already prepared for what was coming. They sat down together. They opened the file. The lien was there. It was not hidden. It was filed exactly where it should be in the sequence of documents that a careful review of the estate's property records would have found. But it was also not flagged, not summarized, not transferred into the running account of the estate's obligations. It had simply existed in the strong room in a file that Henley had controlled and that no one else had looked at. Elizabeth read through it carefully, twice. Then she said, "It's a private lien, not a bank. An individual." "Who?" Alexander said. She turned to the signature page. They both looked at the name. "Margaret Farrow," Elizabeth said. Alexander did not recognize the name. He said so. "I do," Elizabeth said. He looked at her. "Margaret Farrow was a woman in Fredericksburg," she said carefully, as if choosing each word with deliberate attention. "She died 3 years ago. Her estate was managed by her son." She paused. "Her son is William Farrow." Alexander looked at her steadily, waiting. "William Farrow is Charles Henley's brother-in-law," Elizabeth said. The office was absolutely silent. The lien on the western quarter of the Whitmore estate, a lien filed 6 years ago before Alexander inherited, never disclosed, never resolved, had been filed by the mother-in-law of the man who had been managing the Whitmore estate's affairs for 8 years. "He knew," Alexander said. "Not a question. He knew from the beginning," Elizabeth said. "He came into this position with prior knowledge of a claim against the estate's most valuable underdeveloped quarter. And he has been sitting on it for 8 years. She looked at the document. If he had disclosed it, the lien could have been addressed, paid, negotiated, cleared. It was not a large sum originally. She turned to the date. With 6 years of accumulated interest, it's considerably larger. "How much larger?" Alexander said. She did the calculation in her head. He watched her do it, the small movement behind her eyes that meant numbers were running. She told him. He breathed out slowly. It was not estate ending. It was serious. It complicated the Western Quarter arrangement materially, but it was not the catastrophe that Henley had perhaps been counting on it becoming, because Elizabeth had been building the timber relationship carefully with documentation and confirmed terms rather than on the assumption of clear title. "The buyers," he said. I am writing to them this afternoon," she said, "before they hear it from anyone else. We tell them what we found. We tell them how we're addressing it. We tell them the timeline for clearing the lien." She paused. "People can work with problems they know about. They cannot work with problems that surprise them." "The lien itself," Alexander said. Pharaoh's son. Is he? I will find out, Elizabeth said. He may not be aware of the connection to Henley. He may simply have inherited a document his mother filed and been waiting for someone to address it. She was already reaching for paper. If he's reasonable, we negotiate. If he's not, she paused. We bring Pritchard. Alexander watched her begin to write. Elizabeth, he said. She kept writing. Yes, you found this, he said. Pritchard flagged it, but you understood what it meant immediately. You knew the Pharaoh name. You made the connection. I read everything, she said. The commercial reports, the legal notices, the correspondence files, all of it. It's how I found the Henley discrepancy. She did not look up. I have been reading everything that came into this house for 3 years, Alexander. I know, he said. I know that now. He paused. I want you to know that I know it. Not as an acknowledgement of what I failed to do, just as a statement of fact about who you are. She stopped writing. She did not look up immediately. She looked at the letter she was drafting at her own handwriting on the page, and something in her posture shifted, not dramatically but perceptibly. The way something shifts when a weight that has been there long enough to feel normal is lifted. Then she looked at him. We need to go to Fredericksburg, she said, to speak with William Pharaoh directly. A letter will begin the conversation, but this should be settled face to face. When? He said. Wednesday, she said. If I finish the letter today and send it by tomorrow morning, he will have it Tuesday. We go Wednesday. I'll arrange the carriage, he said. She nodded. She went back to the letter. He stayed at the desk and reviewed the deed documents page by page, the way she had taught him, not skimming, not looking for the summary, but reading everything. Looking for anything else that had been filed and not flagged. Looking the way a person looked when they understood that not looking had already cost them considerably. An hour later, he found something else. Not another lien. Something different. A notation in his father's handwriting, a personal note clipped to the back of a letter from a Richmond solicitor dated 8 years ago. The note said simply, "Spoke with Henley. He understands the situation. Trusts him to manage it with discretion." Alexander sat with this piece of paper for a long time. His father had known about the lien, had spoken to Henley about it, had trusted Henley to manage it, and Henley had managed it by doing nothing for 8 years, keeping it buried in a strong room while he positioned himself to control the information. He took the note to Elizabeth. She read it. She set it down. She was quiet for a moment. Your father trusted him, she said, not with bitterness plainly. My father trusted him the way I trusted him, Alexander said, because trusting him meant not having to pay attention. She looked at him. That ends now, he said. All of it. It has ended, she said. That's what the past month has been. I know, he said. I am saying it out loud so that it is said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. The letter to Pharaoh, she said. Read it before I send it. He pulled his chair beside hers. She pushed the letter toward him. He read it. It was as everything she wrote was precisely right, clear about the situation, honest about the timeline, respectful without being obsequious, specific about what they were proposing and what they were asking for. It was the letter of a woman who had learned that clarity was a form of respect, and that problems addressed honestly resolved faster than problems approached with flattery. One change, he said. She raised an eyebrow. The signature, he said. Put both our names. She looked at him. You wrote it, he said. Your words. But this is the Whitmore estate, and we are both the Whitmore estate now. He paused. Both names. She looked at the letter. Then she took the pen and added his name beside hers at the bottom. Alexander Whitmore and Elizabeth Whitmore, side by side. She blotted the ink. Then without looking at him, she said, You should know that Charlotte Pembroke called on Mrs. Morrison this morning. He went still. How do you know? Mrs. Morrison sent me a note, Elizabeth said. She wanted me to know before I heard it from another source." She turned to face him. Charlotte told Mrs. Morrison that the statements Alexander made at the Friday gathering were the word she used was coached, that Elizabeth had prepared the speech, that Alexander had delivered someone else's defense of his wife rather than making a genuine choice. The room was quiet. "She is saying," Alexander said carefully, "that I am not capable of the position I took without being instructed to take it. She is saying," Elizabeth said, "that the man she knew would not have changed, that the change is therefore artificial." She paused. It is the last available argument when all the others have failed. She cannot attack the estate's finances, they are demonstrably improving. She cannot attack the trading relationships Kellner is confirmed. She cannot attack your character publicly after Friday without looking like she is attacking the truth. She held his gaze. "So she attacks your sincerity. And how do I answer that?" he said. "You don't answer Charlotte," Elizabeth said. "That's the point. An answer to Charlotte is an engagement with Charlotte, and any engagement gives her what she wants." She paused. "You answer it by being consistently and publicly exactly who you said you were on Friday. Over time. Without announcement." She looked at him. Actions over months are the only argument against a story about sincerity. He looked at her. "You have thought about this," he said. "I have thought about Charlotte Pembroke since the morning of our wedding," she said, when she told me in the receiving line with a smile that she hoped I understood what I was taking on. She paused. She meant Whitmore Hall, the responsibilities, the weight of the name. She paused again. I thought she was offering me advice. I understand now that she was telling me I was going to fail. She was wrong, Alexander said. Yes, Elizabeth said simply. She was. He looked at her for a moment, at the woman who had received that comment in a receiving line on her wedding day and had filed it away and had spent 4 years proving it wrong without ever having announced that she was doing so. I need to say something to you, he said. She waited. Not as a statement for the record, he said. Not connected to Pharaoh, or Charlotte, or the magistrate, or the estate. He paused. Simply as the thing that is true. She was very still. I was not a good husband, he said. I was not present. I did not ask the right questions or pay the right attention or treat you as the partner you were being, whether I acknowledged it or not. He held her gaze. I cannot repair 3 years, I know that. You told me as much in the garden, and you were right. He paused. But I want you to know that the month I have spent paying attention, actually paying attention, is the best month I have had in 4 years, and that I understand now what I was absent from. Not the estate, not the accounts. He stopped. The sitting room was very quiet. Elizabeth looked at him. For a long time she said nothing, and in that silence he understood something that she was not going to offer him. Quick absolution was not going to smooth the moment over with something forgiving and comfortable, because that was not who she was, and he would not have trusted it if she did. I know you mean it, she said finally. I believe that you mean it. But, he said. Not but, she said. And, she paused. And meaning it is the beginning, not the conclusion. And I am, she stopped, steadied. I am not yet certain what we are building. I know that something is being built. I can feel it. After 4 years of managing everything in silence, I can feel the difference of not being alone in it. She looked at him. That matters to me, more than I expected it to. He did not press further. He understood that this was what honesty looked like from her side. Not a door opened wide, not a declaration, but a window unlatched. Let in what air could come. See what grew. Wednesday, he said. Fredericksburg. Wednesday, she agreed. She turned back to the letter. He stayed beside her and picked up the deed documents again. They worked until the afternoon light changed. Neither of them said anything more about what had been said. They didn't need to. Wednesday came, and with it, Fredericksburg. William Farrow was a quiet man in his mid-50s who had inherited his mother's affairs with the particular wariness of someone who understood that inherited affairs came with complications. He received them in his office, a modest room that smelled of wood polish and old paper, and he looked at both of them with the expression of a man who had been expecting someone to come eventually and was relieved it had not taken longer. He knew about the lien. He knew about Henley. He did not. It became clear within 10 minutes, that Henley had suppressed the lien for 8 years. He had assumed, had been told by Henley at the time his mother died, that the Whitmore estate was aware of the obligation and was addressing it through proper channels. Elizabeth said, "Mr. Farrow, when did Henley contact you about the lien?" Farrow said 3 years ago, when Mother died. He said he would handle the communication with the estate. "And you heard nothing after that?" Elizabeth said. "He told me the estate was in discussion," Farrow said, "that it was being resolved." "It was not being resolved," Elizabeth said. "We discovered the lien 4 days ago. No one at the estate was aware of it." Farrow stared at her, then at Alexander, then back at Elizabeth. "He told me it was being handled," he said. "He told you what kept you quiet," Elizabeth said, not unkindly, plainly. "Mr. Farrow, you are not the wronged party here. Neither are we. The wronged parties are both our families who were kept in the dark by the same man for the same reason, because as long as neither of us knew what the other knew, he could manage both sides to his own advantage." Farrow sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you propose?" Elizabeth placed the letter on the table, the one she and Alexander had both signed side by side, names equal on the page. "A fair settlement of the original amount, plus reasonable interest," she said. "Paid over 2 years in quarterly installments. In exchange, the lien is cleared, and the western quarter title is unencumbered." She paused. "We have a timber arrangement beginning this autumn that will generate the income to cover these payments comfortably. Your mother's original debt is honored. The estate is clear, and Charles Henley has nothing to leverage against either of us." Farrow looked at the letter. "You came here prepared," he said. "We always prepare," Alexander said. It was the first time he had spoken since they sat down. He said it simply, without emphasis, the way a man said something he believed was true. Farrow looked at him, then at Elizabeth, then at the 2 names on the letter. He picked up his pen. He signed. On the carriage ride back to Whitmore Hall, the Virginia afternoon moving around them, Elizabeth sat with the signed settlement agreement in her hands, and Alexander sat beside her. Not across from her, beside her, the way he had been choosing to sit for a month now, and after a long, comfortable silence, he said, "You knew he would sign." "I believed he would," she said. "He's an honest man in a situation that wasn't his fault. Honest people, when you give them a fair exit, take it." "You gave him a fair exit," Alexander said. "We did," she said. He looked at the road ahead. "Charlotte is going to hear about this," he said. "About Farrow, about the lien being cleared. She is going to understand that Henley's last piece of leverage is gone." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "What does she do then?" Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "Nothing," she said. "She does nothing. Because there is nothing left to do." She paused. "Charlotte Pembroke attacks weakness. It is the only instrument she has. When there is no weakness to attack, she stopped. Looked at the settlement agreement in her hands. She moves to the next available target. "And leaves us alone," he said. "Not by choice," Elizabeth said. "By necessity." He nodded. "Then we make sure," he said, "that there is no weakness to return to." She looked at him. "That," she said, "is going to require sustained attention." "I know," he said. "I intend to sustain it." She held his gaze for a moment, the long reading look that had once made him want to look away, and that he now met with the steadiness of a man who had decided he wanted to be seen. Then she looked back out the window. But her hand resting on the seat did not move away from his, and the carriage carried them home through the Virginia afternoon toward the hall, with both their names in its work and both their signatures on its agreements, and for the first time since a joke at a party had split something open between them, the split was not a wound. It was a door. and they were both walking through it. The autumn came to Whitmore Hall with the first timber delivery arriving 3 days ahead of schedule. Alexander was in the estate office when Robert brought the news. He looked up from the accounts, his side of the desk now genuinely his, with his own notes in the margins and his own questions written in the columns, and felt something that had been foreign to him 6 months ago, and had become over the course of a single season entirely ordinary. Competence, his own, earned. He went to find Elizabeth. She was in the east corridor speaking with Mrs. Greer about the household stores for the winter. A conversation she had been having every autumn for 3 years, but different now in one specific way. Alexander was the one who had reminded her about it the day before, because he had read the household management notes she kept, and had seen the autumn checklist she had made, and had said the previous evening, "Mrs. Greer tomorrow." And Elizabeth had looked at him with the expression he had come to value above almost anything else, the one where something behind her eyes moved with a warmth she was not yet fully giving him permission to name. She looked up when he came down the corridor. "Timber delivery," he said. 3 days early." She nodded once. "The mill road was dry this week. I expected they might come ahead." She turned back to Mrs. Greer. "Thursday, then, for the full inventory." Mrs. Greer said yes and went back to the kitchen, and Elizabeth turned fully to Alexander. "The buyers need to be notified," she said. "If delivery is running early on our end—" "I wrote to them this morning," he said. She stopped. "Before you knew about the delivery," she said. "I looked at the weather reports in the Courier yesterday," he said. "The mill road conditions were mentioned in the Eastern County notes. I thought early delivery was likely." He paused. "Was that the wrong call?" She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. That was exactly right. He had learned something in the month since July about what Elizabeth's praise sounded like. It did not sound like the easy approval that most people offered the reflexive "well done" or "how clever." It sounded like exactly right, said plainly by a woman who meant it precisely and not a syllable more or less. It was, he had decided, the best thing he had ever been told. They walked to the estate office together. It was something they did. Now moved through the hall together, consulted together, made decisions. Together with a naturalness that had been built one morning at a time across 4 months of both of them showing up at the same desk and treating the other person's presence as necessary rather than incidental. It had not been seamless. There had been moments of friction, moments when Alexander's instinct to defer to social habit had collided with Elizabeth's insistence on practical reality, or when Elizabeth's 3 years of operating alone had made her reach for a decision before he had fully formed a thought about it. Those moments were real. They did not pretend otherwise. But they had learned in those moments something more valuable than smoothness. They had learned how to disagree in the same room without one of them leaving it. The Henley case had concluded in September. Pritchard had managed it with the thorough efficiency of a lawyer who had built a case on Elizabeth's 14 months of documentation and found the case essentially unassailable. Henley had made one attempt at defense, the argument that his management of the lien had been a professional judgment call, that he had been protecting the estate's financial position by not triggering an obligation they were not prepared to meet. Pritchard had produced in response the note in Alexander's father's handwriting. "Spoke with Henley. He understands the situation. Trusts him to manage it with discretion." The note established that Henley had been explicitly informed 8 years ago and had chosen to suppress rather than manage. The judge had not been moved by Henley's remaining arguments. Full repayment was ordered, plus costs, plus interest. Henley had left Virginia before the order was fully executed, which Pritchard had half expected, and had prepared for the remaining assets were attached before his departure, and the recovery, while not complete, was substantial. Alexander had told Elizabeth the verdict in the estate office on the morning it came. She had read Pritchard's note, set it down, said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "The Western Quarter account. The repayment should go there first." He had looked at her. "Not the general account. The Western Quarter is what he used," she said. "The repayment should go back where it came from." He had understood what she meant. Not just accounting. Something about restoration. About returning a thing to its proper place. Done, he said. The Faro lien had been cleared in October on schedule, first payment made without difficulty. William Faro had written a brief personal note to Elizabeth, addressed to her specifically, saying that he was glad the matter had been resolved cleanly and that he hoped the Western Quarter timber operation would prosper. Elizabeth had filed the note in the correspondence cabinet, third shelf F, the way she filed everything. But Alexander had seen her read it twice before she put it away, and he had said nothing, and she had not pretended she hadn't. Charlotte Pembroke had been quiet since September, not absent. Charlotte was never absent. She was always present in the specific way of a woman who occupied a social territory and maintained it through constant attention. But she had been quiet about the Whitmores, had not raised the estate's affairs in company, had not circulated any new version of the Henley narrative, had attended 2 gatherings where both Alexander and Elizabeth were present, and had spoken to them with the particular careful cordiality of someone who had made a calculation about cost and benefit and had arrived at neutrality. It was not friendship. It was not concession. It was Charlotte Pembroke, understanding with the clear-eyed pragmatism that was her most genuine quality, that the ground had shifted permanently, and that continuing to press against something that had stopped moving was a waste of resources she could spend elsewhere. Elizabeth had predicted this in the carriage on the way home from Fredericksburg. She had been right, as she was right about most things she had thought through carefully. Mrs. Morrison had noted it at the October gathering. She had drawn Elizabeth aside and said in her direct and entirely satisfying way, "Charlotte has decided to be gracious. I give her full credit for knowing when she's been beaten." Elizabeth had said, "I wouldn't call it beaten." "I would," Mrs. Morrison said. "And I'm older than both of you, so my definition stands." Elizabeth had laughed, the real kind. It was Henry Caldwell who surprised them. He came back to Whitmore Hall in November, which neither of them had expected. Not with the uncomfortable mission of the first visit, he came on a Saturday afternoon, called ahead, brought a bottle of good bourbon, and asked if he could speak to both of them. Together. They sat in the small sitting room, the one Elizabeth had furnished over 3 years, into something that was genuinely hers. And Caldwell put the bourbon on the table and looked at them both with the expression of a man who had spent 3 months thinking about something and had decided to say it. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Both of you." Alexander started to speak. Caldwell held up a hand. "I came here in September to tell you that people were questioning who was running your estate," he said. "I dressed it up as friendly concern. It was not. It was—" He paused, choosing the word with more care than Caldwell usually applied to words. "It was me delivering Charlotte's message and telling myself I was doing you a favor." He looked at Elizabeth directly. "I have known you for 4 years, Elizabeth. I watched you manage every gathering at this hall with a competence that I noticed and never mentioned. I watched Alexander forget." He stopped, looked at his old friend. "I watched things happen that I should have said something about. I didn't because it wasn't my business, and because it was comfortable not to." He paused. "What you've done with this estate, what you've both done since July, I should have said so before now." The room was quiet. Elizabeth looked at Henry Caldwell, at the large, well-fed, comfortable man who had spent his life in the easy confidence of someone who had never been required to examine his own blindness. And she saw something in him that she had not seen in September. Effort. Real effort. The kind that didn't look natural because it wasn't natural yet. "Thank you, Henry," she said, simply. He nodded. He poured 3 glasses of bourbon. Alexander accepted his. Looked at his old friend. "Thomas," he said. Henry's brother, the justice of the peace, who had heard Henley's story. "Thomas is embarrassed," Henry said. "He won't say so, but he is." He paused. "He said to tell you that the filing at the magistrate's office was handled correctly and that the outcome speaks for itself." "It does," Elizabeth said. Caldwell raised his glass. They drank. It was not a full reconciliation. It was not the closing of every distance that had opened. But it was a man making an honest effort, and Elizabeth had always known the difference between an honest effort and a performance of one. She accepted it for what it was. They were finishing the bourbon when Robert appeared in the doorway with an expression that meant something required attention. "Begging your pardon?" Robert said. "There is a letter, ma'am. Just arrived. From Richmond." He held it out. "The return address is the bank." Elizabeth set down her glass. She took the letter. She opened it. She read it. Her face did not change the trained composure of a woman who had learned never to react before she understood. But Alexander watched her eyes move through the page twice and then stop at the bottom, and he knew from 4 months of learning to read her that something significant was on that paper. "Excuse us a moment," Alexander said to Caldwell. Caldwell, to his credit, understood immediately. "I'll wait in the hall," he said, and left without being asked twice. Alexander looked at Elizabeth. "What is it?" She handed him the letter. He read it. The bank in Richmond. The institution that held the original loan against the estate. The one Elizabeth had renegotiated in March of 1816. The first major thing she had done alone in the first year of managing the estate's crisis was writing to inform the Whitmore estate that they had reviewed the account in light of the recent resolution of the Henley matter and the Faro lien clearance, and that they were prepared to offer a refinancing of the remaining loan balance at a substantially reduced interest rate effective the first of the year. The reason given was the estate's demonstrated management stability over the past year and the strength of the new trading arrangements with the Kellner operation and the Western Quarter timber buyers. The loan officer had added a handwritten note at the bottom. The documentation provided by Mrs. Whitmore in the original 1816 renegotiation was among the most thorough and well-argued correspondence we have received from any estate account in many years. We are pleased to support the estate's continued recovery. Alexander read it twice. He looked at his wife. 1816, he said. "Yes," she said. "The letter you wrote to the bank, 3 years before I knew you'd written it." "Yes," she said. He looked at the handwritten note at the bottom. "Among the most thorough and well-argued correspondence we have received from any estate account in many years." "They remembered it," he said. "Banks remember good arguments," she said. "Especially when they turn out to be correct." He looked at her. At the woman who had written a letter to a bank in 1816 alone in the middle of the night, after putting 3 years of someone else's estate back in order with no acknowledgement and no assistance. The woman who had filed that letter in the third shelf correspondence cabinet and gone back to work and never mentioned it. "Elizabeth," he said. She looked at him. "I need to say something," he said. "And I need to say it plainly the way you say things without dressing it up." "All right," she said. "I am proud of you," he said. "Not in the way that a man is proud of a thing he owns. In the way that a person is proud of another person who has done something genuinely remarkable." He held her gaze. "You held this estate together alone for 3 years. You caught the fraud, cleared the lien, rebuilt the trading relationships, and you did it all while being forgotten in your own house. And then, when I finally started paying attention, you let me." He paused. "You didn't have to do that. You could have kept managing alone. You had been doing it successfully without me for 3 years. He paused again. "The fact that you let me in, that means more to me than anything else that has happened since July." Elizabeth held his gaze. She did not look away. She did not offer him the quick, smoothing response. She sat with what he had said the way she sat with everything real, fully honestly, without rushing toward the comfortable resolution. Then she said, "You asked to be let in." "Yes," he said. "And you kept asking," she said, "even when I was slow to answer." She looked at the bank letter in his hands. That mattered too. He nodded. She reached across and took the letter from him. She looked at it for a moment. At the bottom note. At the words, "Mrs. Whitmore." Her name on a document from a bank that had remembered her work from 3 years ago, addressed to her because she was the one who had done it. "Accept the refinancing," she said. "I'll write to them tomorrow." "We'll write to them tomorrow," he said. She looked at him. "Both names," he said. She folded the letter. She put it in her pocket, which meant it was going into the correspondence cabinet before the day was out, filed under B, because that was how she kept things. "Send Henry back in," she said. "He brought good bourbon, and he's been standing in the hall long enough." He went to get Caldwell, and she sat in the sitting room she had furnished alone in the house she had managed alone, holding a letter that proved that her work had mattered before anyone else knew it was happening, and she allowed herself privately for just a moment to feel the full clean satisfaction of a thing done right. Not for acknowledgement, not for proof, simply because it had needed to be done and she had done it. Then Alexander came back with Caldwell, and the bourbon was poured again, and the afternoon moved on around them, ordinary and good. 1 year after the night, Elizabeth had stood outside a drawing-room door, holding 31 entries of her own Silence Whitmore Hall hosted its autumn gathering. The guest list was largely the same. The Caldwells, the Morrisons, the Rawlings, the Pendletons. The rooms were arranged the same way. The candles burned at the same height. But the people who arrived found something different from what they had attended the year before. They found an estate that had clearly prospered, not through luck, not through inheritance, but through the visible evidence of two people working it together. The staff moved with the ease of a household that was well managed and knew it. The food was excellent because Mrs. Greer was still there and had been given every reason to stay. The conversation in the drawing room had a quality of substance beneath the social surface because the people who lived in the house had spent a year talking about real things, and it had changed how they occupied a room. James Rawlings arrived early and found Alexander in the estate office going through the quarterly accounts before the guests came, which was so different from the Alexander who had drunk bourbon in this hall the year before that Rawlings stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. "You're working," Rawlings said. "I'm finishing," Alexander said. "Come in." Rawlings came in. He looked at the desk at both sides of it, at the two sets of notes in two different hands, at the system that had clearly been built by two people over many months. "She taught you," Rawlings said. "She let me learn," Alexander said. "There's a difference." Rawlings sat in the chair across the desk. "And how is she?" he said. Not how are you both specifically, how is she, which was Rawlings' understanding without being told that this was the right question. "She's well," Alexander said. And then, because it was true, and because he had spent a year learning that true things were worth saying plainly, "She's the best person I know. I should have known it 4 years ago." Rawlings looked at him. "You know it now." "I know it now," Alexander said. "Every day." Charlotte Pembroke arrived at 7:30. She came in with the composed elegance that was her permanent mode of operation, and she moved through the gathering with the ease of a woman who had decided exactly what this evening was going to be for her and was executing that decision. She spoke to the Morrisons. She spoke to the Pendletons. She accepted a glass of wine from a servant, and she did not look immediately toward the center of the room. When she did look, Elizabeth was standing with Mrs. Morrison and 2 other women in the middle of a conversation that was clearly substantive. Elizabeth had that quality in a room. Now Alexander had noticed of people orienting toward her, not because she performed or announced herself, but because she said things worth listening to. And everyone in Richmond had spent a year figuring that out. Charlotte crossed the room. Elizabeth saw her coming. She did not tense. She did not adjust her posture. She simply waited with the stillness of a woman who had stopped needing to brace for things. "Elizabeth," Charlotte said, "you look very well." "Charlotte," Elizabeth said, "thank you." A beat. "The estate has had a remarkable year," Charlotte said, measured, genuine in the specific way that Charlotte was capable of genuine, not warm, but accurate. "The Kellner arrangement in particular. People have been speaking about it. The arrangement benefits both operations," Elizabeth said. "That tends to be what people notice." Charlotte looked at her. The full direct look that Charlotte used when she was assessing something she had decided required honest attention. "You were right," Charlotte said, quietly, just for the two of them. Elizabeth waited. "About the dinner," Charlotte said. 3 years ago, when I seated you beside Nathaniel." She stopped, corrected. "When I arranged that evening the way I arranged it." She paused. "I believed I was demonstrating a point about where people belonged. She held Elizabeth's gaze. I was wrong. Elizabeth looked at Charlotte Pembroke, at the woman who had spent 2 years trying to dismantle her, who had been calculating and precise and in many ways worthy of respect for the sheer discipline of her campaign. At the woman who had just said the 2 words that cost her more than anything in her vocabulary. I was wrong. I know, Elizabeth said, simply. That's all? Charlotte said. What else would you like? Elizabeth said, not unkindly. Charlotte almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive, but it came closer than Elizabeth had ever seen it come. She moved away into the room. Mrs. Morrison, who had heard everything, said quietly to Elizabeth, That will have cost her considerably. Yes, Elizabeth said. Are you going to make it mean something? Elizabeth thought about it. About Charlotte's campaign, and the whispers, and the gathering, and the Henley narrative, and all the instruments that had been turned against her over 2 years. It already means something, she said. It means she's done. Mrs. Morrison nodded with great satisfaction. Good. Alexander appeared at Elizabeth's side, not making an entrance, not performing his presence, simply arriving beside her the way he arrived beside her everywhere now, as if that was the obvious place to be. He had a glass of wine for each of them. He handed her hers. She took it without looking at him because she didn't need to look to know it was there. Later, after the gathering had wound down, after the last guests had gone, and the staff had begun the quiet work of putting the hall back to rights, Alexander found Elizabeth in the estate office. She was not working. She was sitting in her chair with a cup of tea that had gone only slightly cold, looking at nothing in particular with the expression he recognized as the one she used when the day had been full and she was letting it settle. He sat beside her. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. They sat in the quiet office with the ledgers on the desk and the correspondence in the cabinet, and the year's work visible in every organized, documented, carefully tended detail of the room around them. Then he said, I told Rawlings tonight that you are the best person I know. She looked at him. He asked how you were, Alexander said. That was my answer. She was quiet for a moment. I once told a room full of my friends, he said, that I forgot I had a wife. He looked at her directly. I have been thinking for the past year about what the honest opposite of that sentence is. She waited. I think it is this, he said. I cannot understand how I ever lived without knowing her. Elizabeth looked at her husband, at the man who had walked into a party a year ago and made a joke that had split something open between them, and who had spent every day since choosing deliberately and repeatedly to be present in the space the split revealed. Not perfectly, not without friction, but genuinely. With the sustained, unglamorous daily attention that was the only thing that actually built something lasting. She reached across and placed her hand over his. You didn't live, she said. You were simply present. He turned his hand under hers and held it. And now, he said. She looked at him. And now, she said, you are here. It was not a fairy tale ending. The loan still had 18 months remaining on its new terms. The Western Quarter would need 3 more seasons before it reached its full timber potential. The Henley repayment was partially recovered, and the rest was a loss they had absorbed and moved past. Charlotte Pembroke was quiet, not reformed, and would always be Charlotte Pembroke. None of it was perfect. But in the estate office of Whitmore Hall, with both their names in the ledgers, and both their hands in each other's, and 4 years of silence finally fully broken, Elizabeth Whitmore understood something she had been working toward without knowing it. She had not needed a man to remember her. She had needed a man to choose to see her. He had chosen, every single day for a year, and that, not the settlement, not the refinancing, not the cleared lien, or the confirmed contracts, or the genuine apology from Charlotte Pembroke, that was the thing that could not be undone. A woman who had managed everything alone had found someone worth managing it with. And this time, she was not going to be forgotten.